Angeles in LA County. And it's warm there too. I like it. I like the warmth. I like the ocean. I do love it this time of year when it starts to warm up. I hope you're having a good day. I hope you've had a good week. And we're going to pick up right here where we left off. Now, just in case you're still, your brain still hasn't settled in just yet, we're looking at page 1. It's kind of the bottom. I'll write it over here on the left. Page, if it will write for me. Here we go. Let's do a little bit of, try to do some trickery. Page 156 in your lecture notes, really the bottom, but then going over to page 157. We're still talking about what are called the surface features of the brain and the cerebral hemispheres, left and right hemispheres. We talked last time about the, going back to this image here, looking at it from the front, this longitudinal fissure right there that separates the brain. If you're looking at the brain from the front, this would be the left cerebral hemisphere. This is the right cerebral hemisphere, and that's the longitudinal fissure, LF, that separates the left from the right. And then we get so many of these views from the side where you can't really see that longitudinal fissure. And then I've got this version that's kind of a cartoon sketch version of it that's not really in your notes. You can tell I just sort of borrowed this off of Google. But I wanted to kind of emphasize some points about one particular structure. Remember that the little depressions in the surface. What are the little depressions? Not the ridges. Not the ridges, not the bumps. What's the term for the depressions or the little valleys between the bumps? What are those called? What's the term for those? You can chat it. You can type it in the chat. Yeah, sulky. Or one of them is called a sulcus. And this first one that I pointed at that goes all the way from the top center, from that longitudinal fissure that's right over the horizon there, and winds its way all the way down, and sometimes comes all the way to this lateral sulcus. This one's called the lateral sulcus. This one that comes all the way down is referred to as the central sulcus, and it's a very important landmark. I'm going to try to highlight it if I can with yellow right over this thing here. I hope it shows up okay for you. That's called the central sulcus. And I mentioned it last week, but I want to emphasize this week that central sulcus is a major landmark in every human brain that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. True. But the frontal lobe is really the only part of, I'm getting to it. Gosh. Act like I've never done this before. The frontal lobe is really the only part of the brain that manages or monitors what we refer to as, this is a little bit difficult because I got to sketch over and over, motor activity. Now remember, we've talked about this before when we talked about the overview of the central nervous system weeks and weeks ago. What's the other word for motor? What's the other term for motor? The word that kind of sounds like, the two words that sound like each other. Motor. What's the other word for motor? It's the other one. It's the other one, Heba. Efferent. Thank you for trying, though. You got us rolling. Thank you. Efferent. Okay. And it may be descending if we're talking about the brain and spinal cord, but it's always efferent. So all of your outbound impulses and signals, pretty much all of them originate from somewhere around your frontal lobe for the most part. There are a few exceptions, but most of them originate in the frontal lobe, the motor. The rest, all the rest, parietal, occipital, temporal. Told you I've done this before. I'm used to drawing upside down. Temporal. All the rest is sensory, all the way around. Okay, so all these other lobes of the brain, what you're going to see as we talk about these in more detail and show you, better views that are labeled from the textbook. I promised you, I know what I'm doing. But I want you guys to see this. This is not really emphasized. I do it all for you guys. You know I do. This is not really emphasized in your lecture notes. So I'm spending, a few minutes at the beginning class on some stuff that you probably won't be tested over. But I do want you to see these big picture patterns that most people don't miss. If all we do is just dive into, the frontal lobe does this, and the parietal lobe does this, and the occipital lobe does this. Everything the frontal lobe does has something to do with some kind of motor output. Now, some of that motor output, as we're going to see in a little bit, we're going to look at this in more detail. Some of that motor output is stuff that we might actually call thinking, reasoning, decision-making, things like that. But these are still motor, yes, movement, of course. Absolutely. I think most people associate motor with body movement for sure. But I wanted to list a few things that are motor that most people don't think are actually motor activities, but they are. You wouldn't think of thinking and reasoning and decision-making as motor activities, but they're kind of internal motor activities that don't involve the movement of the body. But making a decision is the motor activity. It's not bringing in impulses from the outside world. That is sensory. So we're going to see some other big general patterns as we go along, that these other three lobes back here, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, all of their activities are some kind of sense. So we're going to see, parietal is mostly somatosensory. This is the sense of touch from your body, from the surface of your body. Occipital, visual, sensory. So all of the information from your eyes goes to your occipital lobe. Temporal does a lot. It's hearing, sensation, balance, also a sensation, a sense of balance, equilibrium. The smell, the sense of taste. The sense of taste is partially shared with the temporal lobe and this little area that's there's an area that's sort of in between. If you could see where I drew those two little red arrows, if you could get your fingers right in there and pull that lateral sulcus apart, you'd see there's another part of the brain in there called the central lobe or the insula. And it kind of shares some of the taste activity too. But they're all the senses. All of your senses go to these other parts of your brain. So a lot of the cerebrum is just processing sensory input, not motor output. So now when we look at these nice artistic illustrations from the textbook, and we look at the area of the brain known as the primary motor cortex. Now remember, let me go back again to that photo of the frontal section. Remember that when we talk cortex, we're talking about just this little layer, the little gray matter, which is actually just the darker tanned layer at the surface. Remember that the darker tan gray matter in the middle are referred to as nuclei. The gray matter at the surface is called cortex. That's a Greek word for bark. Not like what a dog does, but the crispy, crunchy outside of a tree. The bark of a tree is the word cortex. That's where that word comes from. So somebody looked at the brain and said, it's kind of the wrinkly surface, if you can imagine the bark of a tree, and that's how it got its name, cortex. I think it's kind of a creative name. It's one of those unusual anatomy names that I kind of like. I think that's a good name for it. So every time you see that, remember, like if you see motor cortex, we're talking about the part of the brain that's motor, so this is going to be frontal lobe, and only that maybe 1 centimeter thick layer at the surface. Okay? So again, if we look at this image, this weird image of it looks like a naked human draped over the top of your brain. I'll get to that in a second. But if we look at the cortex, we're looking at just the cells right there at that surface, which we are looking at. When you look at the surface of the brain, you're looking at the cortex the same way if you look at a tree, what you're actually looking at on the trunk is the bark. There's more under the surface, but what you're actually eyeing at the superficial surface is the cortex, right? Let me erase all this mess so it doesn't get confusing. The primary motor cortex is just the part located in that precentral gyrus, okay? So the precentral gyrus is the location of the primary motor cortex that activates specific skeletal muscles. And over the years, researchers have put little electrical probes into different, look at this picture over here in the middle with this strange figure draped around the outside of the brain. They've put probes in different places. So if they put an electrical probe in the cortex here and they stimulate it for a split second, they can make the thumb wiggle. If they put it right here in the cortex and stimulate it for a second, they can make them stick out their tongue or wiggle their tongue or move their jaw. If they put it right here, they can make their eyeballs move. If they put it there, they can make them raise their eyebrows. If they put it there, they can, but they're all motor activities. It's stimulating specific skeletal muscles. And the map that was created, and remember, a map is an imaginary image of a real world place, okay? So when they map out those different areas of the body that control specific muscles, this was done, 100-something years ago or more, where they mapped all these out and said, right down there, if I stimulate that right there, I can make your toes wiggle. And I stimulate it right there, it's more of your heel. Right there, it's your calf. There, it's your knee, and so on and so forth. And they said it kind of maps out like the body. And that image, that map, is known as a homunculus, a motor homunculus. That's a very weird word. The word homunculus means little man. So when they drew the map, somebody looked at that map that you see over there on the right side of your screen and said, looks like there's a little man on the surface of your brain. And that's where the name came from. It just comes from the Latin word that means a little man. You don't really have a little man on the surface of your brain, or a little woman, one way or the other. But the map is called the homunculus. So this is the map is a really useful guide, because a neurologist or a surgeon can see which areas, and again, it's just on this precentral gyrus too, just on that precentral gyrus. Right out in front of that area is an area that contains more of decision-making areas, premotor cortex. I don't see that as highlighted in your lecture notes, so you don't need to worry too much about it. But these are other parts of the frontal lobe that kind of do some decision-making about moving body parts. Another one that I'm pretty sure is on here, but I don't see it in bold. Yeah, there it is. Lower part of page 157. is Broca's area. Broca's area. It's known as, you can see it in your lecture notes, and it's going to be right in this area, and it's known as the motor speech area. The motor speech area. And it's mostly found primarily, I think, on the left side of the brain, primarily. But if you think about all the different muscles you have to move to speak, I do it all day, every day. I'm either teaching somebody in a class or yelling at my kids. Every time you have to talk, there's a lot of muscle that you have to coordinate. So your diaphragm for the air, the muscles of your vocal cords and your larynx in your voice box, and that's just to make the sound. But then to make the sound create sounds that make words, that's your tongue, your lips, your soft palate, the back of your throat. There's a lot of movement required. Broca's area is a central location to coordinate all the muscles for speech. And as we're going to see later in class today, that involves a lot of different muscles and a lot of different cranial nerves as well. So, and again, remember motor, so sending impulses to muscles. Remember that each side of the brain is contralateral. So that means that the right side of the brain controls muscles on the left side of the body. Left side of the brain controls muscles on the right side of the body. So take a look at this picture up here again, and the way up here in the upper left. In the upper right, sorry. This is the left side of the brain. So this precentral gyrus of the left controls the muscles on the right side of the body. So if a patient had a stroke and they can't move their right hand, we know that the stroke is on the left side of their brain, and knowing that they can't move their right hand, we look at the homunculus map, and we can say, we have a really good idea of exactly what part of the brain that stroke affected. If we can look at the symptoms and use this map, that's what the map is useful for, is just we can know exactly where the potential damage occurred. Now there's a sensory map as well. Well, before I move on, I do want to mention this. I've seen this as a former on a former test as a short answer question. So did I get everybody's attention? Potential test question alert, everybody. Potential test question alert. Get back in here from the kitchen. Our red flag. Let's put a big red flag up here. Potential question. Wake up. Wake up. Are you in the bathroom? Are you in the kitchen? You in the other room? Come back in. It's just a short one, but it could be really easy, and it's right in the middle of page 157, guys. Pyramidal cells. That woke you up, though, didn't it? Even if you were awake, you were just kind of dozing off. You were looking at your Facebook page, weren't you? I know. I can't force you to pay attention, guys. I can't force you to pay attention. That's your choice. You came here by your own choice. But pyramidal cells have a really good name. They're usually kind of upside-down triangles. They have little dendrites that kind of stick out from all different sort of directions. But their soma, their cell body, is like this little upside-down triangle or upside-down pyramid. Let's see. They'll have a little nucleus in the middle. Kind of create a spot for a little nucleus here. So nucleus right there. And then they'll have like this single axon that shoots down like this. And it's going to be all crinkly. It's going to have these little axon things. But these are, and typically they're going to be connected to each other. So there'll be another little pyramidal cell over here somewhere. You'll look at these with your lab instructor in lab. I hope you get a chance to look at them in the microscope slides. But these are in the cortex. Okay, remember the cortex is gray matter. Gray matter is unmyelinated, right? So it tends to be darker, and it's mostly soma and dendrites, okay? But these cells are uniquely found in the motor cortex. These pyramidal cells are unique to the motor cortex. And these axons will fire action potentials out of the motor cortex. And if you take a look over here on the far right at our little homunculus map, these are those projection fibers. We talked about those last time, but go back and look at that again. These are those white matter projection fibers leaving the motor cortex that are the myelinated axons of pyramidal cells. The soma of the pyramidal cells are up in the motor cortex, and whichever ones of these fire action potentials are the ones whose action potentials will go down through the spinal cord, they will cross over either at the medulla oblongata or the spinal cord somewhere further down, and will synapse with lower neurons that will send action potentials out to your actual skeletal muscle. So the movement of skeletal muscles really begins with these pyramidal cells in the motor cortex. I've said about as much as I can remember that, because this is not one of those short answer questions that I contributed. Somebody else wrote it, but I've definitely seen it on older exams and phrased in a couple of different ways. What are the cells in the motor cortex that start voluntary muscle contraction, I guess is a good way of thinking about how the question might be phrased. Pyramidal cells, okay? You guys got that? There's that. If that one shows up on the exam next week, that's a gimme, right? That one's just like, that's a layup, okay? All right? But you're welcome. And there's also sensory areas. Now, the sensory areas, remember, are really all of the areas of the parietal, occipital, and temporal. But just the first part, just behind the central sulcus, that's called that post-central gyrus. I'll kind of draw another line to it the way that I did on the other one. That post-central gyrus contains what's called the primary somatosensory cortex. It's the kind of extra dark purple gyrus right there. That the gyrus itself is called the post-central gyrus, and it contains the cells of what's called the primary somatosensory cortex, the sense of touch from all of your body surfaces. And again, just like on the previous one, we have a sensory homunculus also, or somatosensory homunculus, because again, researchers put electrodes into certain parts of the cortex, but when they did it on the post-central gyrus, nothing moved, but the subject, the volunteer, sometimes they weren't volunteers back in the day, it wasn't always ethically done, the volunteer would say, yeah, but I felt a pain, and where was the pain? So if this is the right side of the brain, they would say, I felt a pain on the left side of my chest or the left side of my torso, or right here, ow, that made my left pinky finger hurt, or, that makes the left side of my face hurt or feel warm or cold or sting or tingle or something. So that's the somatosensory cortex, and that's the somatosensory homunculus. It's the imaginary map that says, if we've got a patient who has numbness and tingling on down the whole left side of their body extending into their left thigh, then they might be having a stroke on the right side of their brain, and we can look at the homunculus map and get a reasonably good idea of exactly which specific spot. It would be right up here on the actual brain, where the cortex area is that's had a stroke and that's potentially lost blood flow. That's what a stroke basically is. Now, we have another area back here in the parietal lobe. It's going to be located a lot in this area here. Now, I'm overlapping a little with the temporal lobe, because it does actually overlap, and it's at the top of the next page. It's called, I've got it on my screen. I always try to say it correctly. Nothing is controlled by the postcentral gyrus. Nothing is controlled by the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is the center of sensory input from the body surface. Sense of right here, sense of touch from the body surface. Okay, so I always try to say it correctly in German. So if anybody out there is German, please pardon my terrible attempt at German. We usually call it Wernicke's area. I've heard people say Wernicke's area, but it's correctly pronounced in German Wernicke's area, and it is. Let me just kind of draw it, sort of. Kind of a dotted line right around in here, and it overlaps. I'm going to put a big W on it right there. It overlaps a little bit with the temporal lobe. This is your speech comprehension area. Okay, so that is sensory as well. If you have a patient who can hear you talking but cannot understand a word that you're saying, and it sounds like you're speaking in a foreign language that they have never heard before, it's likely that they have a stroke in Wernicke's area, because that, if you can imagine how horrifying that is, they can hear you. It's not a volume thing. They hear you just fine. They hear you talking. And, you know, I think that most people, if you hear somebody speaking a foreign language, especially if it's one of the big, well-known ones, if it's, you know, again, if it's German or, you know, Spanish or French, the one that trips me up sometimes is Portuguese, and I have to listen to it a little bit, and I go, oh, that's Portuguese. I recognize that. Okay. Italian, you know, the biggies, you sort of listen enough and you go, I don't understand a word that you're saying, but I do understand that you're speaking another language. Okay. That is not a problem with Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is you can hear that they're talking, and this is what's scary. Patients can even recognize that you are speaking their language. They recognize that you are speaking English. They just can't understand a word of it. It sounds like you're speaking, English gibberish, something like that. So strokes in Wernicke's area are very, very scary, very difficult to even diagnose as well. So that's where it's located. And you can see, because speech processing is partially hearing, it overlaps with part of the auditory cortex, which is located in the temporal lobe. Okay, that visual cortex I already mentioned is in the occipital lobe, and it's all occipital lobe. The whole occipital lobe is visual cortex. The auditory cortex, though, in the temporal lobe, is shared with the olfactory cortex, also temporal, and the gustatory cortex, also temporal. Olfactory and gustatory share a little bit with that central lobe that I mentioned before. If you had a real human brain in your hands and you could kind of get your fingers right in there, that lateral sulcus, and pull down on the temporal lobe a little and pull up on the frontal lobe, you'd see that there's a little bit of an island in between. We can see it right over here. Here's the temporal lobe. There's a bit of the parietal lobe there. And if you separate it apart a little, you see there's actually another area in there that sometimes is called the central lobe, deep inside. You can't see it on any of the surface pictures, the central lobe there. And the central lobe kind of shares some activities with the temporal lobe. But again, these are all sensory areas: sense of vision, sense of hearing. What is olfactory? What sense is olfactory? What's the olfactory sense? Sense of smell, because it smells like an old factory, right? That's everybody's way of remembering it. What is gustatory? What is gustatory? Taste. Yeah. You have heard that word before. You've used it before. You've used it as a root word. You don't know it, but you've used it. Where have you used gustatory before? If something tastes bad, you say it is what? Disgusting. You don't necessarily say it that way, but that's the Latin word for taste. Disgusting. If you are a person of great taste, and you have, and this is similar to the word for fun or enjoyment in Spanish, gusto, gusto, gusto or gusto. Someone with good taste was Augustus. The name Augustus means good taste. The month of August was named after Caesar Augustus, but Al means good and gustus means taste. Didn't mean that he tasted good. I don't think they were cannibals. But it does mean that he was a person of refined taste, is what the word means. Taste obviously has multiple meanings. During surgery, the superior portion of the post-central gyrus of a patient's brain was stimulated. What is this patient most likely to do or feel in response? We looked at this one last time, so let's think about it now. Think about it again. Post-central, sensory or motor. That's the key word. Now, we looked at this one last week. I wanted to look at it again. It's going to come up. Post-central, motor or sensory? Sensory. So cross out anything that's motor. Okay? The rest of the question doesn't matter. One word matters in that question. Okay? Here's why I wanted to look at it again, because I got a follow-up that I modified a little bit. If the stimulated region is specifically the right post-central gyrus, where will the patient feel the pressure? If they're feeling it in their toes, which toes? Yeah, the left toes. They'll feel like somebody's stepping on their left toes if you stimulate that right post-central gyrus, because remember, brain is contralateral. Okay? All right. So I know we looked at that first question before, but I wanted to change that little bit of a follow-up. Now, if we work in deeper, we get deeper down. We get to these other areas of gray matter. Remember, we've been talking about the cortex, the gray matter, about roughly 1 centimeter of gray matter at the surface, right? Deep down inside, we get to what are known as the basal nuclei. They're called basal nuclei because they're found around the base of the cerebrum, basal nuclei. And these control motor movements, but they control semi-voluntary motor movements like walking, reaching for a cup of coffee or tea or some beverage, and raising it to your lips and drinking. Things that you don't really think about, like maintaining muscle tone. The major neurotransmitters of the nuclei in this area, you don't need to know all the names of the nuclei, right? There are a number of them that are listed as examples. Globus pallidus, caudate, putamen. They're listed there in your lecture notes, but they're not in gray. You don't have to, so they're not in bold. They are gray. They are gray matter, but they're not in bold. But I do want you to know the neurotransmitters. Even though they're not bolded, I think they're important to know for later. We'll talk about them more later. We've already talked about a little bit about acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the major neurotransmitter of that space that we called the neuromuscular junction back in the day, right? Remember that space between axon terminals and the motor end plate, the neuromuscular junction. So this area of the brain also uses acetylcholine for its function. It also uses dopamine as well. There's one particular area of the basal nuclei that I think is not pictured in the image down at the very bottom, but I can show it to you on this image over here. It's kind of right in here and right in here. And it's referred to as the substantia nigra. And the substantia nigra specifically uses dopamine to kind of control unnecessary extra muscle movements, to kind of inhibit those extra muscle movements. And if the substantia nigra cells don't produce enough dopamine, you'll end up with excessive muscle shaking and movements that is referred to as a tremor, an intention tremor, like when you reach for something, like your muscles might be real quiet and settled, but when you reach for something, your hand starts to shake, and that's the tremor that we see in the disease known as Parkinson's disease. One of the sure signs of Parkinson's that's asked about there in the note. What would be the signs of Parkinson's disease? That would be tremor, the uncontrolled shaking that's caused by unregulated skeletal muscle movement. Okay. What about what?
Tourette's. That's what I'm trying to spell. Tourette's,
No, are you talking about Tourette's?
Yes, that.
Tourette.
I think. Yeah. Isn't that
Tourette's.
like Tourette's as well? Well, no.
No, Tourette's syndrome is a totally separate syndrome. Yeah,
Okay.
Tourette's. It's a French word. Yeah.
Okay. I think
It's
I think something else.
Yeah, no, it's a completely different disease from Parkinson's, and it's a whole separate disease as opposed to a condition, or I'd say a symptom of Parkinson's. How would Parkinson's be treated? Well, it can be treated with dopamine. It can be treated with dopamine. You don't treat it directly with dopamine because dopamine deficiency is what causes Parkinson's. But you treat it with a precursor form of it that's called L-DOPA. L-DOPA, it's a chemical that you can give intravenously, and the brain can use it and it gets turned into dopamine. But it's temporary, and the Parkinson's is a progressive degenerative disease, and it doesn't get better. Unfortunately, there aren't any cures for Parkinson's. There are a number of celebrities that you might be familiar with that have died of Parkinson's. One of them is still alive to this point. One of my favorite actors from Back to the Future and Family Ties, Michael J. Fox. And Michael J. Fox has put a huge amount of his massive wealth into Parkinson's research. And, when people do something like that, at one point I get kind of cynical and I go, yeah, you're just trying to find a cure for yourself. But he isn't. He could just put all of his money into trying to privately, separately find a cure for himself, which he might be doing privately. I don't know anything about it. But I do know that he's contributed billions of dollars to Parkinson's research. Yeah, Muhammad Ali was the other one that I was going to mention, who passed away just a few years ago. If you can still stream it on YouTube. If you've never watched on YouTube, I know this sounds really strange, a funeral before, you can still watch Muhammad Ali's funeral and just the things that people said about him. He was older than me. So when I was a little kid, we grew up hearing about Muhammad Ali and Sugar Ray Leonard. And, oh my gosh, that was amazing. I still remember in 1996 when the Olympics were in Atlanta and Muhammad Ali lighting the Olympic flame. Again, another thing that you can watch if you're just in need of some inspiration on a given day, you can find more than just crap on YouTube. You can find some inspirational things. Find the video of that 1996 opening ceremony of the Olympics in Atlanta I know it was overshadowed by the bombing and all of the crazy stuff that happened that year. But Muhammad Ali lifting that torch and lighting that flame, that was just, I remember just welling up. That was amazing. And then, watching the funerals, he's one of the most famous people that lived with and fought Parkinson's and struggled with it. But just a great person. I was going to say something else about that, but anyway, it was kind of a sidetrack, so let's move along. If I remember it, I'll bring it back up again. I am the greatest. And he was. Maybe not the greatest boxer of all time. Sorry. These are just little commercial breaks for my mind, guys, when I've been talking constantly for almost an hour. But I just heard that Tyson and Holyfield have agreed to fight again. Has anybody heard about this? Is anybody going to watch that? The ear bite? No, did you hear about it, Juanisha? So I just heard that Tyson, Tyson and Holyfield have both agreed to terms to step in the ring together again. That just seems so crass and commercial to me. It's like, wow, are you guys... It is. It's pandemic craziness. Let's blame it on that. All right. Anyway, commercial over. Back to our regularly scheduled programming. Exactly. I don't know that Evander Holyfield needs it. I would. So Tyson was the greatest. There was a window of time where he was amazing, and he let it all go to his head. But he was stunning to watch. There's no doubt about it. But it wouldn't surprise me that he would be the one that would need the money. I'm not going to rag on Evander Holyfield because his kid Isaiah went to school here and was a running back for us at UGA for a couple of years, and I think he was really good. I think he was a good running back. I wished he could have stayed longer, but anyway, I think they're both they're going to be sitting in the corner. Before the bell rings, the first round is over. They're going to both have to just take a break and breathe. Let's move along to diencephalon. Now, take a look at this picture way up here. This is our zoomed out view. And now we're looking at just the right side of the brain, a cross section right through the middle of the right side of the brain, there. And what we're looking at is this area kind of in the center, and there's a zone right in the middle that kind of is sort of oval shaped right there. It looks like this on a real human brain. It's kind of, I know it doesn't look like I'm pointing at anything in particular, but I'll try to outline a specific part of it. It's kind of right in here, and it includes areas right up in here, but it also goes up inside there. This is a little cave that goes up into that lateral ventricle that we talked about last time. And that you could actually kind of get your finger up inside there if this was an actual brain that you could get your fingers on. And you could go up inside there and feel the inside of that ventricle that goes all the way through the right hemisphere. But there's part of this area called the diencephalon that's included up inside of there. So the diencephalon is not a specific area. It's several areas, and the largest area is called the thalamus. And the thalamus is actually not a thing either. It looks like it. Take a look at this picture down here, this kind of reddish, purplish, whatever color that is, that's labeled thalamus. It looks like a thing, but it really isn't. It's actually an area where there are a bunch of nuclei. Excuse me. But these nuclei are sensory nuclei. Okay, let me go back to the previous screen where we got started talking about famous boxers. We were looking before at, now this is, so if we go back up here, higher up right in here, this area right in there is that thalamus. that we're going to look at on the next page. That you can see how much darker it is than the surrounding areas. These are the basal nuclei, and they mostly control motor movements. So they are kind of the traffic cops, so to speak. They're the traffic cops, these basal nuclei, for impulses leaving the brain and going down the spinal cord. Notice they're going to cross over. Most of them are going to cross over here in the medulla oblongata. They're going to cross right there. And if I move this away, you can see them headed for that crisscross, right? Speaking of crisscross, makes you want to jump, right? I'm not going to talk about that either. Sorry, I've done too many rabbit trails today. Nobody's going to dress backwards. So they crisscross here, right there, and these basal nuclei around them regulate that. Now, we're going to look at an area a little bit different that's right up in here, that's the thalamus, and it's going to process sensory input that's coming up the spinal cord. It's coming up the spinal cord over here, but also coming from the other senses like the eyes, nose, taste in the mouth, and the tongue. These senses will come in. So this frontal lobe of the brain right here is kind of sitting out. Your eyeballs would be right there. Your nose would be right in between the eyes and the mouth below it. So there are a lot of sensory tracts that are coming in through these areas and will come through this thalamus, and it's a major sensory relay station. Its job is to make sure that sensory input coming into the brain ends up being directed to the correct area of the sensory cortex. Okay? So let's go back. I'm going to go backwards to another picture from before. This will do. So deep inside the brain, there's a thalamus right here. I'll put a big T on it right there. In the upper right. So a sensory impulse coming from your fingers, for example, coming up the spinal cord, the thalamus is going to make sure that it gets to the correct part of this homunculus, of this post-central gyrus, so that the brain accurately and correctly feels the pain or the sensation in the correct place. There are people with psychological conditions where there's confusion about this, that you can touch a certain area of the skin, cause a stimulus, but to them it feels like it's coming from another part of the body because there's some malfunction in the thalamus that doesn't relay the impulse to the right part of the postcentral gyrus. If it's coming from the eyes, the thalamus makes sure that it does not go to the parietal lobe, but that it goes to the occipital lobe if it's coming from your eyes. If it's coming from your nose, the sense of smell, the thalamus makes sure it doesn't go anywhere else except the proper location in the temporal lobe for smell. So that's really the major function of the thalamus is really major complex, very complex. The only sense that does not actually pass through the thalamus actually is the olfact. I said nose goes to the temporal, but that was a mistake. The only sense that does not go through the thalamus is the sense of smell. It's the only one that doesn't go through the thalamus. All the others do. Taste, vision, all the senses of touch, pain, pressure, all of them go through this sensory relay station known as your thalamus. It's also a part of this thing that we'll talk about later called the limbic system, which is related to memory and emotion. Now, still looking at the same area, here's this region known as the thalamus, and there's a little flat spot right there just below it called below the thalamus, hypothalamus. And it really just looks like this flat area, but when you look at a schematic like this of what just looks like flat on the surface, it too is another area that has lots of nuclei that control lots of functions of the body. But now, these are controlling vital body functions that are things that are unconscious or subconscious. These are not voluntary. They might be motor, but they're not voluntary. These are centers that sort of internally take input and then send output without you having to think too much about it. So body temperature control, you don't directly control your own sweating when you're hot. You don't directly control yourself shivering when you're cold. Your hypothalamus does that for you. Osmotic control of the blood, big topic for A&P2 later next semester. But remember that the hypothalamus has actually a lot of mechanisms to make sure that you don't dehydrate or overhydrate, actually. And it does that by monitoring. It pays attention to the osmolarity of your plasma. And if the water levels of your plasma start to go down, it stimulates a sense of thirst. And that's where this is the part of your brain where thirst comes from originally. A sense of hunger. It's monitoring blood sugar levels, blood sodium levels. It's a major control for this nervous system that we'll talk about next week, called the autonomic nervous system, the ANS for short, that has the two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, that can get you ready for action and then calm you back down after. And also helping regulate sleep-wake cycle. The hypothalamus brings your body temperature down and your blood pressure down as you're ready to sleep, and then does the reverse while your body is getting ready to wake up. You don't even notice it. If you wake up in the morning, your brain has already started a bunch of activities to get you ready to wake up by slightly raising your body temperature, raising your blood pressure, raising your heart rate a little bit, bringing those things up so that your body is ready to get up out of the bed, which seems like it's never ready to get out of the bed for me. But my hypothalamus is still hard at work for me. It also is a part of that limbic system that I mentioned on the previous slide. It's got connections to these things that are referred to as mammillary bodies. Those are pictured way over here, that kind of stick down from just behind this gland called the pituitary gland. Those are the mammillary bodies. And you can just see some of the wiring and the connection between the hypothalamus through the mammillary bodies and then back up to the thalamus. And these are connected to higher centers of the brain, which are related to emotion and memory. Memory, I want to mention this, I know you probably know this. Memory is not located in any specific part of the brain. Memory is a whole brain thing. Being able to remember the facts that you need to remember for your A&P exams. They're not stored in one particular place. And the more different parts of your brain you can activate while learning, the easier things will be to remember. So if you can do something active by rewriting things or typing them out, typing things over and over again to practice your spelling, you're activating multiple different parts of your brain while learning these things. But the hypothalamus's role, in it is these mammillary bodies that are located right behind it. The epithalamus, which I don't really have slide. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. I don't know why I put that there. The epithalamus, same photo again, same photo. Thalamus is just this round region right under this big mushroom-shaped thing called the corpus callosum. The thalamus is right there. Hypothalamus is just there, okay? And then right back here, kind of behind the thalamus, is this area known as the epithalamus, but the main thing of the epithalamus you need to know is the pineal body, or the pineal gland, as it's known. And the main thing that you need to know about it is it secretes melatonin, and melatonin helps the hypothalamus regulate that sleep-wake pattern. They are closely connected. They're very closely connected. I will say that I don't want to bust anybody's bubble. If you take melatonin to help you sleep, I'm not saying that you need to stop, but there is no evidence that the melatonin you take actually makes it to your brain. And melatonin by itself cannot make you sleepy. It's melatonin working with the hypothalamus, and it's constantly changing levels of melatonin that regulate the sleep-wake cycle. We do know that high melatonin levels work with the hypothalamus to make you sleepier, and then declining melatonin levels early in the morning help the hypothalamus prepare you to wake up, like raising your blood pressure, raising your body temperature, all those things that signal preparing to wake up. But melatonin by itself doesn't. The role of melatonin by itself isn't known. And, I usually always just sort of put this out there that there is no evidence that the melatonin tablets that a person takes actually even get into your brain at all or cross the blood-brain barrier. If it helps you sleep and has what we call a psychosomatic effect, a psychosomatic effect is still, a placebo effect is still an effect, right? Even if I don't think that you can always just dismiss a placebo effect as completely ineffective, because if it's a placebo effect, it's still having an effect. You just don't necessarily. It would work if we gave you a sugar pill, which is what a placebo is, or if we gave you actual melatonin, it would probably work about the same. That's generally what the evidence shows. So, but if you need it to help you, if you need that mental trigger to prepare your brain to fall asleep, then, I ain't stopping you. But if you don't really need it, then maybe your money is better spent somewhere else. But, excuse me, sorry, got a little bit of something in my throat. So, which of the following is characteristic of the basal nuclei? So, one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize about those basal nuclei, the big picture, they regulate motor functions, okay? And it was the thalamus that was sensory. So, if you see a question like this and you're not 100% sure, just try to remember the basal nuclei have something to do with motor function. So kind of get rid of anything that has anything to do with sensory, right off the bat. Your vital functions, respiration and blood pressure, that's hypothalamus. That's all that, that's all that subconscious, involuntary, stuff. Voluntary muscle activity, all of that comes from the pre-central gyrus. Okay, so it's not that one. So repetitive movements like walking, and also remember there's one of the basal nuclei called the substantia nigra that helps smooth out those repetitive movements, using dopamine to smooth those movements so you don't have a shaky tremor. All right? So, why did I go here? I'm skipping. I don't want to skip. Don't skip for now. I'll get back to the limbic system because it's further along your notes. I should have sorted these. Brainstem, page 160. 3 parts of the brainstem. I told you guys this last week, and I want to remind you, memorize these in order. All right? I've seen it as a short answer question. List the parts of the brainstem in order from superior to inferior. Midbrain, pons, medulla. Okay? This is your major connection between what we call the upper brain regions, which we've been talking about, the cerebrum and diencephalon, and the cerebellum and the spinal cord are all kind of connected. So your upper brain, like your cerebrum and diencephalon, part of the thalamus, connects to the cerebellum and the spinal cord through this area in between known as the brainstem. Very, very critical area. The brainstem consists, take a look down here in the lower left, mostly of tracts. So what will that look like on a cross-section of brain tissue? What are tracts? What will it look like? Gray matter or white matter? I'll give you a 50-50 shot. Gray matter or white matter? I put the choices out there. White matter. Tracts are bundles. Tracts, remember, I'll go back to it now. I'll get back to you, limbic system. I'll get back to you later. All the way back here. You made me go back. Let's see, where have I got it? Okay, within the central nervous system, the nuclei, like the basal nuclei, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, those are gray matter because they consist mostly of soma and dendrites. Okay? I just want to review this over and over again. I want to just drill it into your brain so that you don't even have to really remember these basic patterns every time, and you'll have more space in your brain to remember other stuff. The things that are tracts, are these and these. This white matter area, these are massive bundles of axons that are myelinated axons, okay? And remember, we talked about the different kinds of tracts, the association tracts, commissural tracts, projection tracts. I know it's been a week ago, but those are called the tracts within the brain. And they are, those tracts are white matter. So when we look at the brainstem, and you see something like this that says mostly tracts, you've got to be getting to the place where you've studied this so much and so often that when you see the word tracts, you know it's white matter, and what that means, you also know what that means. Okay? You just gotta say this to yourself over and over again and groove it in your brain. Right? It's just the basic patterns of the central nervous system that if you just memorize these things over and over again, you'll have more room in your brain to learn other stuff rather than constantly having to think about tracts and nuclei, because it's just gonna come up a lot, y'all. So the brain stem is mostly just a connection between upper regions of the brain and lower brain regions like the cerebellum and then spinal cord as well. So it is the intersection. It's like an intersection. And it's major pathway intersection for ascending and descending tracts. There's that word tracts again, right? White matter, myelinated axons, okay? Almost all of the cranial nerves originate in the brainstem here as well, in this area known as the midbrain pons and medulla. And again, take a look at the top of page 160 in your lecture notes. I'm just saying, this is not just Mr. Nichols making a big deal out of this. It's like, again, in the lecture notes, Dr. Schultz is reminding us what are tracts, what are nuclei, which are white matter, which are gray matter, and it's like we've talked about this, but it's been a few pages in the lecture notes. Let's talk about it again. Let's go over it again, okay? Let's see. The medulla, the pons, the midbrain. Where's your midbrain? Where's the stuff of the midbrain? All right, so they're kind of doing them in opposite order. I can do that too. I can do my reverse order. I can skip. Here we go. Medulla oblongata. It's the first one listed in the lecture notes, so I'll do them in the same order as lecture notes. On page 160. Mostly tracts, almost entirely tracts. Some of them are sensory. Some of them are motor. Remember, if they are sensory tracts, they are ascending sensory tracts. Actually, unfortunately, this is under little letter B, so this is all, I know, you're welcome. But now I just noticed that I put my sensory and motor in the opposite order of how they are under point number 1 in your notes. There we go. Maybe that helps a little bit. My bad. But the sensory, it says, are these ascending or descending? So they are ascending. Remember that tracts are white matter, axons, myelinated. Okay. Where are these tracts going? Oh, that is a good question. Where are these tracts going? These are ascending sensory tracts coming up from the spinal cord. Where are they headed? Too general. Sorry. Nope. Can't give you credit for it. There it is, Cheryl. Man, nice. Dongsil, I'm going to give you partial credit. These signals will eventually get to the post-central, but hey, don't let it go to your head. Pardon the pun. I'm only giving you partial credit. Cheryl's getting full credit. Does everybody see what she said? Did everybody see what she said? These tracts, this low in the brain, will all go to the thalamus, and they will synapse in the thalamus. So what you got in the medulla, here's the medulla right down here. It's this kind of orangey shaded region, and it mostly consists of axons that are just carrying their impulses up. And when they get to the thalamus, see the thalamus right here, they'll synapse. They'll have axon terminals where they will synapse with new cell bodies in the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is gray matter, so it's mostly soma. Then those axons will go to the post-central gyrus. Okay? So the actual axons down here that are in the medulla will not go to the post-central gyrus. They will go to the thalamus. Kudos, Cheryl. Okay? The information is destined for the post-central gyrus. But the actual tract in the medulla oblongata will never make it to the post-central gyrus. Those axons will end in the thalamus and release neurotransmitter and then go from there. Okay? These ridges on the front, let me point them out with my pointer. These little ridges on the front of the medulla, these two little ridges right here, there and there, are known as the pyramids. These two ridges on the front are the pyramids, and these contain mostly the motor fibers, the pyramids on the ventral side of the medulla oblongata. And these pyramids contain descending axons coming from the pre-central. Now, these actually are coming from the pre-central. These actually are coming from the pre-central. They do not stop in the thalamus, because remember, the thalamus, they don't cross until they get down here. There we go. Erase that one right there. Probably couldn't see it anyway. It blends in with the pons. The thalamus is sensory only. So these impulses are coming from pyramidal cells. Sorry, I keep running out of my own space up there. Pyramidal cells in the precentral cortex, and the axons of those pyramidal cells go right down through. They have to pass the basal nuclei for control and regulation. And then they get down here where they kind of emerge on the front as a long lump on the front. And then they do this. They cross over at that little fuzzy area right there on the front. They cross over. That crossing over of the pyramids is called back over here on the left, the decussation of pyramids. Does everybody see that is bold in the middle of page 160? 85% chance that's a short answer question on the test. Maybe 83%. There's a really strong chance. Decussation of pyramids. Practice typing that phrase. Practice typing it so you know how to spell it correctly and you'll get it right on the test. Where the motor fibers cross on the ventral side of the medulla oblongata is known as the decussation of pyramids. This is how the left, in this case over here, the left side of the brain sends fibers to the right side of the spinal cord. Okay? Decussation of pyramids. Now, the brainstem, this part of the brainstem, the medulla oblongata, is mostly tract. It's mostly tracts, but there are a few nuclei. Remember that nuclei are gray matter, soma, dendrites, unmyelinated, blah, 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 blah. Certain vital centers, heart rate is controlled here, respiration rate, blood vessel diameter, which controls blood pressure. There are 1, 2, 3 of your 4 vital signs right there, guys. For those of you going into nursing, or actually really a lot of other branches of healthcare, you will have to learn how to take a patient's vitals, their vital signs. There's 3 of the 4 right there. The other one is controlled by your hypothalamus, which is your body temperature. So temperature, respirations, heart rate, blood pressure, the 4 vitals. Some non-vital centers, meaning they're not necessary for life. Vital means necessary for life, vital signs. Other non-vital centers like controlling vomiting, controlling swallowing. The term for vomiting is emesis. Coughing and sneezing. These are all 4 of those are closely related. Coughing excessively sometimes can cause because the sensation of coughing is perceived. Particular activating system. I haven't talked about it yet, but I will. In the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, you'll see it all the way through. I say yep again because I'm doing them backwards, as well as cranial nerves there that we'll talk about in a little bit. We'll take a break and then we'll talk about the cranial nerves. All right, so now we're going to back up, go through my slides backwards a little bit, and we move to the top of the next page called the pons. Pons is also mostly tracts again. The tracts are referred to as cerebellar peduncles. Weird word, but it comes from, it's a word that means footstool. You can see the word ped for foot there. Footstool, peduncles. So somebody looked at the pons and looked at the midbrain right here and said, these look like a footstool that the brain sits on top of. And so they called it the footstool long before they knew what it was. So this one's called the cerebral peduncle. These back here, these things going back here are called the cerebellar peduncles. I'll try to draw where the cerebellum would normally kind of stick right out there like that. So it's been cut in this image, so you don't really see how it's attached. But the pons is the major anchor point. Maybe that's a better way of thinking about it. It anchors the cerebellum to the back of the brain stem. It also is a major intersection for signals going in and out of the cerebellum as well. And the cerebellum's major thing is muscle coordination and balance. So the cerebellum needs both sensory input for balance to know whether or not you're balanced, as well as sending motor output to control muscles to keep you balanced. So this is something that the cerebellum really specializes in so that your cerebrum doesn't have to think too much about it, think too much about your balance. All right? So those are the major tracts that are located in the pons, just into and out of the cerebellum, which sticks out behind it, the attachment points called the cerebellar peduncles. There are also nuclei here as well for respiratory. Remember, the pons shares respiratory control with that medulla oblongata, which we just looked at. So I always found this really confusing. I was like, wait, which one of them controls respiratory? Is it pons or medulla? Well, it's both. Both of them have nuclei that control different parts of breathing, which you'll learn more about in A&P2. So we're going to leave it at that for now. The respiratory centers of both the pons and the medulla. Also, reticular activating system, which I'll talk about in a little bit, as well as the origins for cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8, which I don't, again, not in bold. You don't have to remember which parts of the brainstem have the roots for which cranial nerves. And then finally, working our way up to the top, the midbrain. This is the top part. It's the part that's kind of in green in this diagram. It's the cerebral footstool, the cerebral peduncles. So the cerebrum sits like a king up on its throne and its footstool. Somebody probably imagined it that way. But these cerebral peduncles that you can see look like these vertical lines are really mostly just voluntary motor tracts. Since they're motor, they are descending. Okay, that's primarily what's in those voluntary motor tracts. And the rest is nuclei. There are a number of nuclei. Remember, nuclei are like these little control centers. And if we look around the back of this is towards the front. This is towards the front of your body. And if we go and look around the back of the midbrain, there's these little bumps right here. And if we turn the whole thing around and look at it from behind, there's actually 4 of them. These 4 little structures back here. These are referred to as the corpora quadrigemina. And the key clue there is the word quad, which means 4. These 4 little lumps. There's 2 upper ones called the superior colliculi, and there's 2 inferior ones called inferior colliculi. So these 2 upper of the 4 are called the superior colliculi, and these 2 lower are the inferior colliculi. The upper 2 are a visual reflex, and the lower 2 are an auditory reflex. An example of the auditory reflex is if you hear a loud sound somewhere, you hear the sound, the inferior colliculi send signals to your frontal lobe to help your brain know how to turn your head to where the sound is. That's what's called the auditory reflex, responding to a sound by turning towards it, if that makes any sense. The superior colliculi are a visual reflex, which would be something like if you see a bird in your peripheral vision, or something flies by in your peripheral vision and you dart your eyes towards it to look to see what it is. It's not right in front of you, but it's maybe off in the periphery. the superior colliculi control moving your eyes to that stimulus to see what it is. And you can see how these are very primal survival. That's why they're in this basal part of the brain that sometimes is referred to as the reptilian brain or the lizard brain, because all of these structures down here in the brainstem are identical from just about all vertebrate animals. If you looked at this part of your dog's brain, it would look almost exactly the same. So your dog, your cat, your pet lizard, for that matter, is going to have these exact same reflexes, and it's going to have a corpora quadrigemina that does the exact same things. For some potentially dangerous stimulus coming flying at you from out of nowhere, it's good to turn your head to get a look at it first, or some scary sound to be able to see where that's coming from. We already mentioned the substantia nigra, which is located in this region of the brainstem that produces dopamine to inhibit those basal nuclei and control excessive movement. There's also an area known as the red nucleus. This is what controls muscle tone, which is keeping muscle at just the right tension and ready for action, which is mostly about just the right actin myosin overlap. Remember how those fibers, those thick filaments, overlap with the thin filaments, and this that Z line right there on either side, and just the right amount of overlap between the two in that area known as the A zone, just the exact right amount of overlap gives the right amount of muscle tension and keeps muscle ready to go when you want to contract it. The red nucleus is totally in charge of keeping the muscle at just that optimal overlap. The reason it's red is just because it has a lot of blood vessels in the area, so it's got a lot of capillaries that actually kind of make it look a little bit red. And of course, reticular activating system, which we will talk about in just a minute. All right. We'll get to you. I want to talk about the cerebellum. Again, trying to do everything in order of the book, not in the order of my slides. I promise in the future I'll put these in the correct order. To my future students, I'll get these right. Top of page 162, a bit about the cerebellum. The cerebellum is your major control of muscle coordination and balance and equilibrium. So I said before that it's attached. Here's a little bit better image right down here. There's the pons. And these are those cerebellar peduncles that are kind of cut. But now you can see the cerebellum attached to it. And remember that one of the major things I wanted you to know about it was that this cerebellum depends on both input from the pons, I'll try to draw a big inbound arrow, as well as output to the spinal cord and the brain. So the cerebellum needs to know what body position you're in. That's called proprioception, which is understanding the current body position. This is a bold-faced word in the middle of 162, guys. Proprioception. Proprioception is how the brain has sensory receptors all over your body in all of those joint capsules that we've talked about before that measure the angle of your joints to determine your body position at any given moment, so that if your frontal lobe, way up here, if that frontal lobe decides it wants to move, it's going to need the help of the cerebellum, because the cerebellum has been constantly monitoring body position. And one of the things that's important to know about how the brain works is you can't just randomly start to move your body. That would be referred to as ataxia, uncontrolled, uncoordinated, voluntary muscle movement. So if somebody has had damage to their cerebellum, the frontal lobe will try to start movement, but it won't be coordinated because it doesn't have the help of the cerebellum. The job of the cerebellum is to say, I know what position you're in right now. I know that this is your cerebellum talking to your frontal lobe. I know that you want to move your body over to the refrigerator to grab a snack, but you're going to have to do the following movements in a particular sequential order to get your body up off the chair, cross the room, over to the fridge. I'm just giving you a random example. But this is like the frontal lobe says, I want a snack. That's not how your frontal lobe talks. But it's like the frontal lobe has this big, great, huge idea. And the cerebellum's job is to go, okay, you want a snack? All right, I can help you get that snack. But we have to know where your body is right now relative to the refrigerator and what position it's in. That's proprioception. Your cerebellum processes about 60 inputs per second, 60 times a second. The cerebellum is, and this is even if you're just sitting still. Sitting still, the cerebellum is still 60 times a second monitoring the position of your body, whatever position it's in. And it is ready to advise the frontal lobe at any second if that frontal lobe decides, I want a snack, or I want to go to Burger King, so I need to get my car keys, or I need to do some movement. The cerebellum says, I know what position you're in right now, and if you will follow these coordinated sequences of muscle movements, I will help you get to the refrigerator to get that snack. It's the best way that I can think of for you to understand how the cerebellum helps the cerebrum. The cerebrum decides the movement it wants to make. The cerebellum helps coordinate the muscles to get there. Because you think about it, guys. Think about it. If I just want to pick up my coffee cup, I'm going to turn that on. There we go. There we go. Hey. You can see I got to move. I didn't reveal my camera before. I have had the privilege of relocating inside the house. I'm really happy about this now. I'm not out in the laundry room anymore. I'm in one of the kids' rooms now. I know, I'm super happy. I'm so happy. I'm on the central air conditioning system now. I'm so lucky. Because my wife wants to turn the laundry room into an exercise room. So really, it's her motivation. It's her world. Check this out. Watch. If I want to do something as simple as my coffee cup is empty, but if I want to do something as simple as pick up my coffee mug, we got to take them when we can get them, right, Tanya? If I want to pick up the coffee mug, let's see here. Here we go. Pick up the coffee mug. I've got to contract these muscles on the front, biceps brachii and brachialis, right? But I also have to relax triceps brachii on the back. Right? Being able to contract one muscle on one side means I have to force the other muscles on the other side of the joint to relax. Okay? That's a kind of complicated coordination I don't want to have to think about when I just want a sip of my coffee. Just using that one example, think about how much more complicated it is when in a few minutes I'm going to take a break and I've got to get up from my chair. Right? I've got to coordinate muscle movements in the hips and the legs. All of that is coordinated by my cerebellum. And the cerebellum coordinates all of that movement for me by using patterns of learned activities that it has learned throughout my life. Throughout my whole life, it's been learning these patterns. Do you guys remember learning how to walk? Do you remember learning how to walk? I don't either. I don't remember learning how to walk. I remember watching my children learn how to walk, and the joy and the excitement and the agony and the ecstasy of bumping their little chins on furniture and falling down and picking themselves back up again and watching it from their perspective. But I don't remember any of that. But you know what's amazing about knowing some of this brain anatomy and physiology? I can watch as I can look at it. I can say, I can see your cerebellum learning what works and what doesn't work. Now I can't see their cerebellum. They don't have see-through skulls. Wow, that would be cool, wouldn't it? Never mind about that. I don't want to think about that. That would be kind of crazy, but cool. You can't see the cerebellum, but that's the cerebellum at work. Every time you try something new, physical with your body, okay? Let's say, for example, we got some people in the class that have never played tennis before, but as an adult, they decide they want to learn how to play tennis. I highly recommend it. Not tennis in particular, but anything new you can learn to do with your body. Keeps your brain young, keeps it flexible and active, and it constantly challenges your cerebellum to learn new activities, okay? So maybe Tai Chi or yoga or something like that that's, whatever you would consider age appropriate. But those kinds of things, the research is very well described that learning these kind of activities as an adult are very good activities for keeping the brain young. And people that live long, healthy lives and are mentally sharp into their 90s, a body in motion stays in motion. I like it. But people that remain mentally sharp are people that remain physically active throughout their lives and constantly challenge themselves to do new things with the body. And that's because they're keeping their brain young by challenging it to do new things. Two systems real quick. Then we'll take a break and talk about the cranial nerves and the spinal cord. Limbic system, page 162. The limbic system is this kind of, you can see under the heading brain systems in the middle of page 162. You guys see that? In the middle of brain systems, it says that these involve more than one major part of the brain. That's why we kind of save these for last, and we have two of them we want you to know. Limbic and reticular formation. The limbic system is what we sometimes refer to as your emotional brain, because they regulate emotion, motivation, and drive. Okay? In fact, the word emotion comes from the prefix ex in Latin, which means out, and motion comes from motor, or movement. And so the word emotion means to take feelings from inside and move them to the outside. That's kind of where the idea comes from. And most of them come from a few of these areas in the brain that are part of the limbic system. And you've got these listed, bottom of page 162. You don't need to know exactly where they are in the brain. I just wanted to map them out for you. So the first one that you've got listed there is the amygdala, and it's down in the temporal lobe, and it really is your assessing fear. Is this a situation to be afraid of? And assessing whether or not you need to respond to this fear. So we might all remember our first day of kindergarten, our first day of school, the primal fear of fight or flight, those kinds of things. The cingulate gyrus. Well, I mean, are you saying the fear is annoying? But it's very, very primal. And again, these limbic system, this is a part of the brain that we have in common with almost all vertebrates. That kind of raw primal fear is something that has kept our ancestors alive? Well, sure, making us nervous for dumb reasons, but the dumb reasons, sure, yeah, I think I see what you're saying, and I get it. But those dumb reasons that we think are dumb and not very important are mostly kind of, because of this modern, super highly organized, predictable world that we humans have created for ourselves. But it's interesting that we still sometimes have these primal fear responses to things that maybe really aren't exactly dangerous. Like the first day of school, or, the primal fear of not passing anatomy and physiology. Not passing anatomy and physiology is actually not a life or death situation. But your brain creates a fear that is equivalent to the fear of life and death over the possibility of not doing well in this class, which I agree, that's for lack of a better word, I'll use Ilya's term, is dumb. It's dumb. Because your frontal lobe knows. We just had church, huh? Your frontal lobe knows you are not going to physically die a death just because you didn't pass anatomy and physiology this time around. You know it, but it doesn't stop your amygdala from creating fear about that situation. And I'll be honest, I still get afraid and nervous about things sometimes too. So even knowing how my brain creates this artificial sense of fear doesn't help it go away, because it's primal. And the word primal comes from primary, which means the fear comes first. The fear comes first. Then I get to choose how I respond to fear. Now this is turning too much into church. Let's move along. These are emotions that you can't control the emotion itself. You control how you respond to the emotion. Yeah, I know. Ilya goes like, I'm sorry, everybody, we got him off track. The cingulate gyrus, I think, is the next thing that's mentioned there, and it's this whole green area around the corpus callosum of the brain. It creates, I could not summarize it. It's emotions of all kinds, but these are what we would call more complex emotions. Not primal emotions like fear. Fear is a primal emotion. Complex emotions, happiness. That one's a hard one to even understand if you think about happiness. You know how you feel when you feel happy, but you don't always know what it is that makes you feel happy. You don't always know exactly what it is that makes you feel happy. Why is it that an experience can make you feel happy, and then years later, only the memory of the experience can make you feel happy? You can feel equally as happy remembering the experience, and that cingulate gyrus will generate the same emotional response to the memory of that experience as it did when you actually had the experience. Every time I think about the moment I saw, ooh, I'm getting teary. Sorry, guys. Let me woe that up. The moment I saw my daughter's head coming out, I can still feel that emotion. I can still feel it. The moment I saw my first baby coming out. The other one's not so much. I was like, oh God, another mouth to feed, right? But the moment that first one, my sweet girl, my only girl, and I can still feel that. That's all coming from my cingulate gyrus. I am not currently having the experience of my first child being born. My cingulate gyrus has look at this. This is our fourth piece. This is what I'm showing you, the relationship. There is a relationship between emotions and memory, and it's connected. Look how the green and the red of the hippocampus overlap. Because in emotions and memory, can often be one and the same. So, the fear and nervousness that you sometimes feel while you're studying can actually help and assist the memory. We know for a fact, and we've known this for decades, that people that are in traumatic, fearful circumstances have stronger memories of those circumstances and can remember details that other people that might have been in the same area didn't even notice those details. But somebody having a fearful experience in that environment can remember details that the other people can't. When it comes to studying for anatomy and physiology, though, the memory and the fear sometimes work at opposite odds. You're not nervous or afraid while you're studying, you're afraid while you're taking the test, and the fear impairs recall, remembering. Fear enhances putting the memories in to begin with while you're studying, but you're usually comfortable, you're at home, you're in your house, you're in your apartment, you're in a comfy place, you're relaxed while you're studying, and there's no fear to enhance the memory. I am not going to make any suggestions on how you can enhance your memory with fear. I'm just going to mention the fornix that connects the hypothalamus to different parts of the limbic system. Okay? And we'll leave it at that. And then I skipped all that. Let me mention this reticular formation. I've just got one slide about it because there's not a lot to know about it other than the key part of the reticular formation that you can see in bold on page 163 is known as the reticular activating system. So I know that these terms kind of overlap. The reticular activating system is a subdivision of the overall reticular formation. So all the parts, I couldn't find a good picture, so I found the best one I could on a Google image. The whole reticular formation really includes parts of the basal ganglia, the thalamus, all of the brainstem, the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain, parts in between the pons and the cerebellum. But there's a certain specific area right in the middle that's midbrain, pons, and medulla. Midbrain, pons, and medulla that includes these three parts called the reticular activating system that connect throughout the brainstem and help regulate sensory input and control alertness, as well as what stage of sleep you might happen to be in at the moment, the state of alertness and the state of sleep that you're in. So reticular activating system helps wake you up in the morning with, again, working together with the thalamus and the hypothalamus. It uses